Hi, this is College of Circles. I'm Jeff, and today I'll be discussing what is, in my humble opinion, the strongest spell in Dungeons and Dragons, and the only spell I have ever considered banning from my tables. A spell that is so strong I don't even use it anymore as a player because it makes core parts of the game too easy and sucks the life out of the game for every player not using the spell. This spell is so strong, it removes an entire pillar of D&D gameplay and renders the core role of two classes redundant and ultimately obsolete. What is this game-breaking, fun-sucking, argument-creating travesty of game mechanics? It's not Counterspell, Conjure Animals, or even Wish. I am, of course, talking about Find Familiar. Before I get into the meat of my argument, I would like to invite you to subscribe to my channel. I love talking about D&D and want all of the YouTube audience to join in the discussion. And if you like this video after watching it, let me know with that thumbs up button. Now, some of you will immediately agree with me, while I'm sure most of you will be skeptical of my claim. In this video, I will make my case about why Find Familiar, as written in the 2014 Player's Handbook, does too much for its meager cost and the negative impact it has at the game table. In a separate video, 10 revised first level spells for Dungeons & Dragons Part 1, I'll present my changes to Find Familiar. Find Familiar is a first level spell that has a casting time of 1 hour, has a ritual tag, is instantaneous, and costs 10 gold pieces worth of charcoal, incense, and herbs that must be consumed by fire in a brass brazier. In a game that is all about resource management, this spell is effectively free of cost. The 10 gold pieces of consumables is negligible in almost all games after the first session. In casting Find Familiar, you gain the service of a spirit, your choice of celestial, fey, or fiend, in the form of an animal. The familiar acts independently of you with its own initiative and turn. It can take any action except the attack action. It remains until it is dropped to 0 hit points or until you permanently dismiss it. You can also temporarily dismiss it as an action into a pocket dimension and cause it to reappear in an unoccupied space within 30 feet of you. You can communicate with it telepathically as long as it is within 100 feet, or see and hear through the familiar using its senses. Finally, you can use your familiar to deliver spells with a range of touch as if you were in the familiar space. No other spell in the game does as much with no resource cost, all at first level. Now, let's unpack the effect all of these abilities have and the problems they create. We'll start with the choice of familiar. You can choose from a bat, cat, frog, hawk, lizard, octopus, owl, poisonous snake, quipper, rat, raven, seahorse, spider, or weasel. All of these are CR0 creatures with 1 or 2 hit points, except for the octopus, which has 3, and each has a unique set of traits offering nothing because there is really only one option, the owl. You're taking the owl, I'm taking the owl, everyone is taking the owl. Even underwater, I'm probably still taking the owl. As Chris at Tree at Monk Temple points out, and I wholeheartedly agree with, if one option is clearly superior to all other options, then we really don't have any options. Now, why is the owl such a superior option? Because in combat, it can fly, give the help action, and with the flyby trait, get away without taking any attack of opportunity. You can essentially give one player advantage on an attack for free every round of every combat. True Strike, the worst spell in the game, gives advantage and costs an action. Guiding Bolt costs an action, a spell slot, and gives the next attack advantage plus its damage. The Rogue Mastermind has as its main subclass feature being able to use the help action up to 30 feet away and has to use their bonus action to do so. But a wizard with Find Familiar gets to do the help action for free and as many times as there are rounds of combat, all because of the owl's flyby feature. It doesn't even cost a bonus action to give the owl a command. Second, the spell itself is poorly worded and confusing in regards to communicating with the familiar or looking through its senses. As an action, you can look through the familiar's eyes and hear through its ears. However, while doing so, you are both deaf and blind. But you can also communicate telepathically with your familiar. So as it's written, your familiar should be able to just tell you everything it sees and hears without you having to use an action or losing your own senses. This is wildly open to interpretation and could mean the owl can talk freely to you and describe in great detail everything it sees. Or it could be a limited communication, as Jeremy Crawford stated in a Twitter response. Or it could be that you can communicate with the familiar, but it can't communicate back, as would be implied if one took the ruling from Sage Advice when looking at the Warlock's Awakened Mind feature. There is a similar issue with the spell Find Steed, which I will address when I get to level 2 spells, but that spell had this feature clarified in an errata. It's ultimately up to the GM and creates a situation of possible discontent between player and GM. I used to rule that the communication was always one way, but have recently softened to allow the familiar to express simple ideas back to the caster. The next trait of Find Familiar to look at is the ability to cast a spell with a range of touch through the familiar. Now, this is one aspect I would not personally change, but it does add to the overall power of the spell and has the potential to outshine the contributions of other classes. When we think of a healing class, we almost always think of Cleric, Druid, or Bard. Overall, they are the strongest healers in the game. However, with Find Familiar, wizards in combat can perform acts of healing that none of these other classes can, as long as they invest in getting the spells Spare the Dying or Cure Wounds. Both of these spells could be taken with Magic Initiate, allowing the wizard to offer better healing from a distance than a cleric could, unless, of course, the cleric had a way of taking Find Familiar. Finally, we get to the BBEG. The main reason Find Familiar is not just broken, but actively ruins gameplay and fun at the table. Now, to really explain this, I need to back up and go over some basic structure of D&D. There are 3 pillars to D&D gameplay: combat, social interactions, and exploration. Of the 3, exploration is by far the hardest to run as a GM and the hardest to perform as a player. There are set rules for combat, and when the GM says roll initiative, everyone pretty much knows what to do. Social interactions are an opportunity for roleplay with occasional dice rolls, and even though it's more free flow than combat, it's generally fairly easy to manage the back and forth between player and NPC, or to balance the time between players. Also, the social interaction is where most of the narrative of the campaign develops and advances. Exploration, however, requires the GM and player to balance the tedious minutiae of walking, or searching for something, or describing what they're looking at over and over again. If too much time is spent on exploration, the game bogs down, or if it gets waved off, an entire avenue of gameplay gets lost. Despite all of these challenges with exploration, when the GM commits time to exploration and it's done right, it can be extremely rewarding for the players. Combat in a long campaign can often become repetitive, and the social interactions are often dominated by the players most comfortable with speaking. Exploration is an opportunity to introduce different types of encounters into a game, create a verisimilitude of the world the characters live in, and offer up rewards in more creative ways other than kill monster, look through its pockets. This challenging but potentially rewarding pillar of gameplay also happens to be part of the core identity for 2 classes, the Ranger and the Rogue. Rogues excel in moving stealthily in the darkness of dungeons or alleys, moving ahead of the party while looking for and disarming traps. Likewise, the Ranger can scout ahead in the wilderness, tracking foes and watching for ambushes. Both classes are mechanically weaker than most other classes, and the game presents few opportunities for these classes to really get their shine during combat and social encounters. For Rangers and Rogues, combat goes like this: roll fairly high in initiative, attack, roll damage, turn done within 30 seconds, wait 5 to 10 minutes for your turn to come around again, and do the same thing. Every encounter, every session. Exploration, however, is their jam. It is what they should be doing better than any other class and gives the GM an opportunity to cater to their skill sets for an encounter. All of this is true to a lesser degree for druids and bards, but as full casters, they can easily make their own highlight moments. Consider 2 scenarios. A party is moving through a dungeon. Option 1. The druid casts Pass Without Trace on the party. A rogue moves 30 feet ahead of the group, searching for traps. The GM has the rogue make perception checks. The rogue hears footsteps ahead, draws his bow, and just as a goblin turns a corner, surprises the goblin with an arrow. Or option 2, the party sits in one place while the wizard says, "I send my owl 100 feet down every hall, tell me what I see." Scenario 2, the party has left the town and is traveling through a forest. The ranger scouts ahead, checking for tracks, and discovers ogre prints to the side of the trail. The party stalks the ogre, catching him eating. Or option 2, the wizard sends the familiar 100 feet in front of the party and says, "Tell me what the owl sees." What really frustrates me as a GM is the players aren't doing anything wrong in these instances. They're just doing the most optimal choice available by the plain text of the spell. And I've been in many sessions, both as player and GM, where these scenarios played out. In one instance, I was the GM and 3 different players had familiars. Guess which animal they all took. They came to an intersection in a dungeon with 3 paths to choose. The 3 players just sent their owls down each corridor, and the other players lost a potential hour of gameplay. There was another instance where I was playing and had a familiar, and the GM insta-killed my owl as it entered a large chamber in a cave. Normally something like that would tick me off, but I wasn't even mad. I could see that me using the owl familiar was taking a lot of gameplay away from other players, so I just rolled with it. And not long after, I stopped summoning the owl altogether. Now, my original claim and title of this video is that Find Familiar is the most powerful spell in the game. That's mainly a function of getting it at first level and having almost no cost, and its overall impact on many aspects of the game. Obviously, in a level 20 one-shot, Wish, Simulacrum, Animal Shapes, or Meteor Swarm will be more powerful. But from levels 1 to 5, where the overwhelming majority of games are played, and even up to level 10 or so, no spell does as much, as often as Find Familiar. What it really does, more often than not, is suck the fun right out of the game. And that's a power we shouldn't allow any spell to have. I'm sure some people will disagree with my assessment. I'm sure people will disagree with my assessment, and some will agree with me. I have not seen very many lists of bannable spells or OP spells that include Find Familiar. Whatever your thoughts are, please leave them down in the comments below. And for my revised version of Find Familiar, check out the next video on revised first level spells.